Yeah, my name is Rob Jones, originally from Columbus, Ohio. I'll kind of give a preview of what we'll be getting into, but my life has taken a lot of turns over the years. I've done had many occupations, done many things. I've been a soldier. I'm a musician. I've been a prison guard, factory worker, forklift driver, mail review stripper at one point, nightclub bouncer, natural foods co-op manager, worked at Lowe's. Now I'm a professor at Western Carolina University. So I've had many twists and turns, very unexpected, didn't know that I would end up doing what I'm doing now. Started off in Columbus, Ohio in a working class, blue collar family. My dad worked at factories, my grandfather worked in factories. So I grew up with that kind of like work ethic and in that kind of environment. The neighborhood I grew up in is notable because it was surrounded by warehouses, factories, in close proximity to a steel mill, trash burning plant. We were surrounded by junkyards, train yards. So I grew up in a very industrial environment, but interesting because it was a working class environment, but we had a mix of like Air Force families because we were in close proximity to an Air Force base. So we had, your regular Midwestern, like, blue collar folks, but with also with Air Force families that had like educated parents and everything, and quite a few families where their mothers came from different countries in Europe or in Asia. So we had an interesting blend in the neighborhood. I was born on what's called the Near East side of Columbus. Those who know Columbus, Ohio would know this area. When I was conceived, my parents conceived me on Seymour Avenue off of Livingston. When I was brought home from the hospital, it was to Rich Street, right off of the intersection of Main and Kelton. So those who know Columbus would know that area. And then when I was 6, we moved to a neighborhood called Southfield. So that was the neighborhood I mainly grew up in. And most people who know Columbus would know Southfield. It was a very notable black neighborhood in Columbus. So I was always different than the other kids in my environment. I could read when I was 2. I was born with 6 fingers on each hand. I still had the little nubs there where they remove the fingers. They call that polydactylism. So I was a polydactyl when I was born. I was what they call hyperlexic. That's able to read at a young age. And then what else was I from there? So that led me to be what's called autodidact, self-educated. So by the time I actually went to college, I went to college in my 40s, and by then, most of the books I needed for each semester were books I already had and had read, some of them many times over. And so later on, I was diagnosed with autism, so that explained the reading at 2. And I was very introspective, introverted as a kid, compared to the other kids. And so that led to a lot of bullying, of course. But the bullying led to interest in martial arts. And then the martial arts stopped the bullying. It was a long process. And then I think the most significant thing in my childhood is when I became a musician. In the 70s, most of my childhood memories are of the late 60s to late 70s. And I grew up watching a show called The Midnight Special, where it'd have live bands on there performing. So then I gained an interest in playing instruments. And that would be the most significant thing I did, the most long-lasting thing that I did growing up. And I spent a lot of time doing it, so I had no social life as a teenager. Wasn't interested in the social life as a teenager. All I wanted to do was play. All my friends were musicians. We all practiced for hours a day, went to concerts together, record stores together. That was pretty much the main thing I did during those years. And then earlier than that, like in elementary school, I was really into comic books. I have old copy of Tomb of Dracula here. I had thousands of comic books when I was a kid. It was easy to get the back issues. They weren't as expensive as they are now. You could go get issues from the 60s for like 50 cents a piece at used paperback stores. And so that was my main interest, like growing up: comic books, music, kung fu, because I was a kid during the whole kung fu craze of the early 70s, like with Bruce Lee and everything. I was like in the front yard with the nunchucks and everything like everybody else. And so then I eventually went to the Army. But before going into the Army, like in high school, I was very different in high school. I didn't date or anything. I just only hung out with musicians. Had crushes on a lot of the girls, but I didn't have the confidence to, even say anything to them. And it was funny because the first time that a lot of them saw me play on stage in high school, the next day they would come up and were interested in talking to me. And but I had to tell them, I said, look, you didn't want to give me the time of day yesterday, so you don't talk to me now. And so then after high school, I actually got kicked out of high school. I got to mention that. I was excessively truant in high school. I had no interest in being there. By that time, like I had a large library of books at home. I read all the time, but school just wasn't interesting to me. Like I said, I could read when I was 2. In 6th grade, I took a reading, like comprehension and vocabulary test, and I tested at 11 years old. I had my reading comprehension level was college sophomore, and my vocabulary was like a college graduate at 11. And so I felt like school just didn't have anything for me, just didn't interest me. So I just stopped applying myself, and eventually was kicked out for excessive truancy. Like I was in high school, like playing in bands and staying up all night and all that. So, so then when I got kicked out, I went and got my GED. And people talk about like studying for the GED. Oh my God, I got to study. I didn't even study for it. I just went immediately and took all the 5 sections at one time. It took me like 2 hours and it just passed, no problem. And then went into the Army, decided to go into the Army. Now, before going into the Army, growing up autistic, and I didn't know I was autistic until later, but looking back, that diagnosis explained everything to my family. It all made sense. So going into the Army, like I couldn't tell when people were joking or not, and I didn't have any filter on what I would say. I would say anything that came to my mind, and luckily though, it was never anything offensive. It was just things that were very weird. And so when I went to the Army, I had to learn how to adapt myself socially, and so that was a process. And so I was stationed in Berlin, Germany, when the wall was still up. I was a military policeman in Berlin, Germany, but I worked at a military intelligence site as a guard. And I had a band in Germany that we would play out places and everything. And so the music, and at that point I had stopped playing music when I joined the Army, but it came back to me. I tried to get away from playing music as an adult many times, and I just always end up playing again. And so yeah, my time in Germany was really eye-opening. It was my first experiences as a young adult out on my own, and in a place like Berlin in the 1980s. I mean, it was just it was maybe a little too much for me, and it was I had a blast. I ended up getting out of the Army early because of having a blast. So I was only in for about 1.5 years, and I got an honorable discharge, but they put on their inability to adapt, which has been like one of my signature phrases in life that's been associated with me, the inability to adapt. But so then after the Army, I got out and just worked a series of like warehouse and factory jobs for a long time, construction laborer. So all I had was a GED, no idea of getting any education. I thought, okay, here I am, this is what I'm going to do. I remember working on a dock and thinking, okay, this is where I'm going to end up in life because I'm a blue collar guy. This is where I belong. I'm going to give up any other aspirations. This is it. But at the same time that I was working in those kind of blue collar jobs, on my lunch break, when everyone else was eating their lunch, I had books like this with me. The Upanishads. This is it's a Hindu scripture that was compiled over a few centuries, the writings are based on teachings that were given like, thousands of years ago in India, passed down by priests. And so this is a translation, an English translation. So I would be on my break with books like this because I was always into like Eastern thought and Eastern philosophies, even as a small kid. And people would ask, what are you reading? I would explain it to them and they would be like, wow, you're really deep. And I mean, they always say that. To me, this stuff wasn't deep. It's just explain what I was experiencing, giving me like a insight on another level of my everyday experience. So there's nothing really, I mean, some people read this as a mystical kind of treatise, but to me, it's very just, very simple and very applicable to daily life. And that interest came, like I talked about the bullying and the interest in martial arts. So I was being bullied for being quiet, withdrawn, and different. And then there was a TV show that came on called Kung Fu with David Carradine in the early 70s. And so I saw this peaceful Buddhist monk who could also defend himself very well. And I was like, okay, I'd like to be able to defend myself, but I still want to be like calm and peaceful like that guy. And so I begged my mom for karate lessons. This is when the whole, like, the song, everybody was Kung Fu fighting and the whole craze of Kung Fu. But at that time, they didn't have the kids classes like they do now. Now every place has the kiddie classes and all that. Then there was no school would take kids except for Taekwondo, and you had to be at least 9. And they would interview you to make sure you were okay with being in class because you had to be in the class with adults. So that also meant not only are you training alongside adults, but sometimes you may have to spar with adults and you're like a kid. So I did that for a couple years and then moved into Kung Fu because when I got old enough to go to a school that would accept people of an older age, then I immediately went into Kung Fu because, Kung Fu, Bruce Lee, that's what I really wanted. And so, yeah, then I learned how to defend myself and that did a lot for me in other ways. It gave me a confidence that like also spilled over into like playing instruments and spilled over into just the way I carried myself. And so martial arts does a lot more for you than, even if you take martial arts and you're not able to go like, completely mop up a bar, all the derelicts in a bar or whatever. That's really not the point. The point is the self-cultivation that you get from it and learning how to be calm, learning how to have insight, learning how to think before you do things and say things. That's the real benefit of martial art. And then on the other hand, like, somebody tries to mug you and they're not armed, you have a better chance of like dealing with that person. So that did a lot for me. And then in the Army, I did continue like martial arts training in the Army. And then after the Army, while I was working in factories, I continued like training in martial arts in different schools and had friends who were like black belts that I would train with and everything. And then also while I was working in the factories, again, I felt like that was as far as I was going to go in life. So in that environment, and you're feeling like that's as far as you're going to go, what do you have going on around you? The streets. So from there, I spent like several years just running the streets, but maintaining a job. A lot of people around me at that time weren't maintaining jobs. Some didn't have jobs at all. Most of them were criminals. A lot of people I hung with, they broke in houses and stole things regularly, stole cars, robbed people. Some of the guys who would be in my living room hanging out and, were smoking joints and drinking beer, they'd later go rob somebody at gunpoint. These were the kind of people I was around. And, everybody was carrying guns. It was the very beginning of when everybody started carrying guns. This was like in the 80s. Before that, like if someone was considered to be like a bad guy, it was because they could handle themselves with their hands. And then in the 80s, that started to change. And I found out later that people in that environment, they thought that I was carrying too, because they said, how, you were so calm and cool in those situations and in that environment, we all thought you were carrying a gun too. And I was like, no, I never carried a gun. I've never owned a gun, I've fired guns in the Army, and then as a prison guard later, I was on a prison SWAT team and had to use guns in training. But, and not that I'm anti-gun, it's just that I just never felt a need to have one. And then and also I have a bad connotation with it because I saw a lot of people who were complete cowards in my environment, complete cowards. and then they get a gun, and now they're walking around with their chest out, and that just, yeah, that's just left a bad taste in my mouth about guns. I don't think guns themselves are bad. I think they're a tool that can be used for hunting, you know, for procuring food or for protecting your home. But the person who just walks around with it and all of a sudden has this inflated ego related to owning a gun, that's a potential irresponsible gun owner. To me, that's the same as, like, for instance, everybody over 21 can legally drink, but should everyone you know over 21 drink? I'm sure you know lots of people over 21 who have no business drinking. Same kind of thing with guns. And so I spent those years running the streets, had a lot of close calls, been shot at a few times, and that was always because of people that I was with. And, you know, I saw no way out of that kind of situation. You know, I saw lots of my friends get killed. A lot of people I knew killed people and then went to prison for a long time. And then I reached a point where I had to finally just separate myself. I had no financial means to separate myself from the environment, but I had to tell everybody, look, you know, we're still cool, but I can't hang with you guys and run around with any of you guys anymore. You know, if we run into each other, we're cool, but I have to separate myself from this. And so upon doing that, I went back to taking a martial arts class, and you know, totally went complete. Not that I had any substance problems. It's funny because I've tried everything, but I never was addicted to anything. And so I just stopped. I didn't drink that much, but I stopped drinking, stopped smoking weed, went to martial arts classes, went completely straight edge. And then in about 6 months, I heard that they were hiring for the prisons because Ohio just had like what was the longest prison riot in U.S. history at that point. And they attributed a lot of that to the lack of staff, you know, not enough staff. And so an ex-girlfriend that worked with my sister gave my sister an application for me to fill out. And so I filled it out and ended up, you know, getting called to take the test. And then after I took the test, I was scheduled for an interview. And at that time, I was working personal security for a singing group. They didn't make it big. They had one song like in the top 50 dance charts. You know, they had the dance chart of the music that's only played in nightclubs. They were called Eve, not to be confused with the rapper Eve. And so I was working personal security for them, and had to go to New York and Newark, New Jersey, and New York City with them. And one of the girls who was also produced by the same producer, she was there. They were doing a showcase show, and she happened to mention, well, I mentioned that I had an interview at a prison to be a prison guard the following week. And she said, what prison? And I told her, and she said, my dad plays golf with the warden there. I was like, what? So she called her dad and said, yeah, I have a friend here. He's got an interview at Orient Correctional Institution with Warden Littlefield. You know, do you mind like calling him and giving a personal reference? So the dad was like, well, I got to meet him because I had never met him. So I had to go meet her dad at an office downtown in Columbus. And he was the director of the Ohio Department of Public Relations. And so he called the warden while I was in the office after we talked and said, yeah, I have a guy here, a friend of my daughter's, Robert Jones. He's coming in for an interview. So I went in for the interview, got the job, of course. And again, I didn't seek to be a prison guard, but it just kind of fell into my lap. And this was the beginning of a series of things just falling into my lap. One of my shortcomings, I think, was that I never aspired to much of anything and never desired much of anything. I just kind of went through life, and whatever happened. So I got the prison guard job, went through the academy. While I was in the academy, instructors approached me about going through the Ohio Corrections self-defense instructor program because they saw my aptitude in martial arts while I was in the academy. So I was like, yeah, okay. I just went with it. And so they did paperwork for me to go there 6 months after my probation was up, to come back to the academy for 5 weeks to train to be an unarmed self-defense instructor for the academy. And so my first day on the job out of the academy in the prison, though, I walk in the gate and there's people hollering my name from like every direction. And I look around like, oh, wow. And then the captain, he's like, is there going to be a problem here? And I was like, no. And he said, well, in 2 weeks, give me a list of everybody in here that you know. And so it ended up being about 13 guys I grew up with in there and 5 of my relatives. But later in the course of the time I worked there, other people that I grew up with and other relatives of mine would end up being sent there. And so that instantly gave me kind of a rapport amongst the inmates. So my relationship was different with them was different than the other guards. Because also coming into that, I'd also spent several years running the streets. So there were people who recognized me from running the streets. Oh, you the guy that drove the black Chevy? Like, yeah, that's me, you know. And so, you know, I had respect because I treated them with respect. And, you know, in the academy, they stressed, and a lot of guards didn't take this to heart, but I did because it made sense. They stressed that, you know, your job is not to be there to punish anybody because their punishment is being there. Your job is just to make sure nobody kills anybody else or jumps the fence. And if anybody needs medical attention, you make sure they get medical attention and to the chow hall for the meals, and that's it, you know. And so yeah, my time there, I mean, I saw a lot of things there that, you know, were crazy, of course. And I spent 3 years working in the hole, which, not the solitary confinement, but I was at what was like the county jail within the jail. And then you had the long-term jail within the jail, because it was just like a city. You know, there's a school, there's a hospital, people go to work, you know, the inmates have jobs. And we're just the police in that environment. And there's like a court in there. There's like a small like county jail kind of thing in there. And there's a long-term kind of place, the hole, as they call it. So I did that for like 5 years. And what actually ended up happening in that was I had a bout with what we thought at the time was mental illness. And so I ended up hospitalized and on disability with the option to go back to working at the prison. You know, I could be on disability for up to 2 years and go back. But while I was off and got out of the hospital, you know, I started like playing music again. Because during those years I didn't play any music. I was just completely hardcore, working out all the time, running 10 miles a day, training in martial arts. As far as socially, I was hanging out with a crowd of people that like own like tattoo and piercing shops. So I was going to nightclubs. That's how I ended up becoming a nightclub bouncer on the side, was like from going to these nightclubs. It was during the period when like, you know, most cities were into having like the big warehouse type nightclubs. Everybody's trying to have the New York City style, like velvet rope, big warehouse nightclubs. And so I was doing that. And then when I got off, I started playing music again and started hanging out at cafes and got into a band and everything, and then realized there was no way I can go back to being a prison guard. So I left from being a prison guard, moved into like a house full of hippies because a girlfriend thought that would be a good thing for me to do, because all those years I was very dark and intense and just wore black all the time. Everything in my closet was black, like all my shirts, pants, shoes, jackets, hats, underwear, everything. And I was into like really like dark gothic stuff, and I was like straight edge. I wouldn't even drink champagne on New Year's. I mean, I had to feel every bit of life's intensity all the way. And you know, very not like that now, very mellow now. And so a girlfriend thought it would be good for me to like become roommates in this like hippie house. And which it turned out being good for me, because next thing I know, I'm wearing tie-dye and growing a beard and hugging people, which I never did before. But from there, I got into a lot of bands, and that's when I kind of, you know, had some kind of notoriety on the Columbus music scene. I had when I was younger, like in my early 20s, I was playing in reggae bands and playing out a lot, and was pretty well known around town for that. But then it dropped out of the scene all those years when I was a prison guard and everything, and then came back doing that. And so then, you know, I led a very bohemian lifestyle, you know, hanging out at cafes and playing nightclubs and in a lot of different bands, and going on camping trips and doing sweat lodges and all, all the typical things you would associate with the hippies, taking LSD and having like, profound trips and thinking that I, have experienced other dimensions and all, all the regular stuff. Ayahuasca, the vine from Central America, and all the stuff. And it was a great time. I mean, I would never change any of that. But from my working class Midwest blue collar background to that was very different. I was very different. I was different in that environment, and then I was very different in the other environment I was in later. And so then eventually, people always thought I went to college because of all my books and all the things I knew about and everything. And so finally, different circumstances kind of coalesced into me actually registering for college. And I started my first day of college the day before I turned 42. There were actually relationships I had before that where girlfriends wanted me to go to college, thought I should go to college, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to college. And it's funny because then I ended up going to college. And immediately it felt like this is what I should have been doing all along. But I think if I would have done it at a younger age, I wouldn't have done it as well. Because by 42, I was settled, I had lived life, I experienced many things and was ready to settle down and like actually start to do something with myself. And I saw it as being possible. Whereas in the past, I didn't really see the possibility of like doing anything with myself. I was just kind of living by the seat of my pants. And so then at first I was a anthropology major, philosophy minor, but then I took a religious studies class, and the professor, she talked me into becoming a religious studies major. So I switched to a religious studies major and a South Asian studies minor. So the study of South Asian culture and languages. So I did that at Ohio State. I studied Sanskrit and Hindi. So books like this that are translated into English, like I can get a copy in Sanskrit and I can translate it. And so then, but before I went to college, interestingly enough, a few years before I went to college, I actually went to India before going to college. I became a grandparent, and a friend of mine who was well off, asked where in the world would I want to go after I became a grandparent, and immediately said India. So I was going to go to India with no kind of connections. I was just going to show up with a backpack and just wander. Whatever happens, just, and which was like me, I was somebody who could show up on the other side of the world and just, because when I was younger, I did the cross-country road trip in the psychedelic painted VW bus, the stereotypical thing, in my 20s, and went to California and lived in Hollywood for a while, but that's another story. So I went to India. Well, I was planning on going, got my ticket and everything, and then a friend of mine said that she knew someone whose ex-wife had a house there in the mountains near the Tibetan border and was looking for somebody to sublease the house because she was going to come to America. And so I was like, well, yeah, I'll sublease the house, let the guy know. So then she took me to meet the guy, and then so I ended up, through him contacting his ex-wife, and we started having dialogue through email and phone calls. And so, yeah, I ended up subleasing the house. So I go to India. Now I have people picking me up at the airport in Delhi. Where I was going to was a 12-hour drive north of Delhi. So I stayed overnight in Delhi, and then the next night went up because it was so hot you didn't want to drive in a car that long during the day. And so I made it up to the mountains, had a 2-story house on 2 acres of land with with a wall around it, gate and everything, in a small village called Sidbari. And I had no culture shock getting to India. People talk about the culture shock. When I came out of the plane and into the airport and the crowds of people, and I'm in India and it's a whole different atmosphere, I actually felt like it was all familiar to me, and maybe due to my lifelong interest in their culture and everything, but I never experienced culture shock. I experienced culture shock when I came back. Yeah. And so I spent my time there, hanging out at temples, going to temples, getting to know people. The villagers all wanted to hang out all the time. I wasn't used to that because I like to keep to myself a lot and just kind of get out when I want to get out. And so, like, for instance, one time I was sick, so I didn't go out into the village at all. And a few days later I came out and they were like, what was wrong? And I was like, well, I was sick. And they got upset that I didn't contact them as soon as I was sick because they wanted to come and take care of me. And so, I wasn't used to that kind of thing. They're very hospitable and everything. And I was about 16 kilometers from a town called McLeod Ganj, which is the site of the Dalai Lama's temple. So I went to that temple a lot and hung out in the courtyard with the monks and everything. Never got to saw the Dalai Lama. He was around when I was there, but I never got to see him. And but that was the town where all the tourists were. So I've made contact with a lot of tourists and everything. But the village I was in was the site of a temple called Gyatso Tantric Temple, or Gyatso Tantric University. And it was the home of the Karmapa, who is a high figure in Tibetan Buddhism. I didn't know that my house was like almost right behind the temple that I was renting. And it was funny, before I left for India, I went to see a guy named Bhagavan Das speak in Cincinnati, who he's mentioned in a famous book by a guy named Ram Dass called Be Here Now, that was released the book came out in like the early 70s. And for a lot of people, it was the book that introduced a lot of Americans to like Indian culture and yoga and Hindu philosophy. And there's a chapter in the book about that guy. And so he was speaking. He was a guy from California who went to India and became a wandering ascetic, like a wandering holy man with no possessions and long hair and beard and everything. So here he was like a 6'5" white guy who was like living that kind of lifestyle in India. But he had come back to America, wrote a book, and was well known. Went to see him speak and met him afterwards and told him I was getting ready to leave for India. And he said, when you get there, you need to meet the Karmapa. Now, India is a large place, and I didn't know who the Karmapa was at that point. And for him to just say that like that, he had no idea. He would have had no idea. I didn't have any idea that when I got there, I was actually going to be renting a house right beyond the Karmapa's temple. So, and I'm always a skeptic of those kind of metaphysical things, even though I've been very into metaphysics. It's like I'm into it, but I'm always trying to like disprove it at the same time, but then that takes me further into it. And so another weird coincidence. And then I get there and you have to show your passport to get into, there's certain days of the week that you have audience with the Karmapa. And when they checked my ID and they saw my date of birth, my birthday was the same as the Karmapa's, different years, but it was June 26th, the same, and just more coincidence. So yeah, my stay in India, it's a whole story in itself. The prison guard thing is a whole story in itself, and the stay in India. But I come back, and a few years after coming back is when I started college. And so I, went through college in my 40s, got my degree from Ohio State University. Didn't know anything about being an honors student. All of a sudden I get an email from the honors college, and one of my professors had referred me to them for me to become an honors student. I didn't know anything about, I was still typing with one finger, I didn't know anything about any of this college stuff. And just, so I became an honors student, did an honors thesis on, my honors thesis as an undergrad was on Indian religious innovators who had impact on Western concepts of spirituality from the 1880s to the 1960s. And so then I ended up applying for grad school, got into grad school at Georgia State in Atlanta. There were other places I was looking at, but my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, she got into a doctorate program at Emory. So Atlanta was where I was going to go. So I got in there, and I had connections there that I didn't know at the time of applying. Is after I applied and they invited me to come down and take a look around, the professors in the department all knew, like, the professors who wrote my recommendations. They knew all those professors, like, personally. And so I got in there. My focus shifted in grad school on the history of magic and the occult, which again was kind of a lifelong side fascination that curiously does blend in with the study of Eastern religions and philosophies. I found out through the work of a woman named Helena Blavatsky, who was she was from Russia in the 1800s, and she traveled the world and studied with different spiritual teachers and everything, and started a group called the Theosophical Society. So through looking into that, I found out that there was a tie-in between magic and the occult and Eastern philosophy. And even now in my courses that I teach as a professor, her name is mentioned in every book that I use in every course I teach. So I kind of see it as my mission to kind of make sure that her name is still mentioned, and the basic ideas of the Theosophical Society are still being taught to younger people who have no idea of this kind of stuff. So the way I ended up teaching was interesting too. Like I just got out of grad school, and I wanted to do a PhD, but my wife got her doctorate, and she wanted to come here because she's from Vermont. She likes mountains, but she didn't want all the snow. We had friends here. We used to come up here from Atlanta all the time. And so we were visiting here to a place that she had done an internship at while she was in grad school. And they told her kind of off to the side, like, look, we're about to post a position. If you're interested, she just stopped by to say hi. And they told her, like, we're about to post a position. We haven't posted yet, but if you're interested, put in an application. So of course she got that job, and we came here. So I had to forego any plans of pursuing a PhD because there was nowhere for me to go here. And but she was the one that was going to make the money. So I came here, started working as a landscaper at first, then eventually started working at Lowe's, and then started working at the French Broad Co-op downtown. I had management experience at a co-op in Ohio, and a friend of mine from Ohio who was working there, they needed somebody to come in as a manager, but also they were having a problem with in the parking lot with people doing drugs in the parking lot and people coming in the store being disruptive. So they hired me to be a manager of a department and to clean up that mess. So I was kind of hired as security / management. So I started there, and I cleaned up the mess there, had a lot of confrontations with people and kicking people off the property. The last confrontation I had to have, a guy was being disruptive and being confrontational with some female customers in the parking lot and everything. And he was obviously intoxicated, so I went out there to confront him. He grabbed one of the other employees and was about to hit him, and I had to quickly take the guy, flip him upside down, and slam him on his face and hold him down till the police got there. And so after that incident, the word got around even more that you don't want to even go around the co-op like that because there's this guy there that And so while I was working there, I get a phone call from I had applied for adjunct professor positions at different colleges, but nobody's needed anything, so I kind of gave up on the idea of that even happening. And so I had applied at Warren Wilson, and somebody called me and said, hey, somebody from Warren Wilson let me know that a professor, a chair of the department from App State was going to contact me about an adjunct professor position. And again, Warren Wilson gave them the reference because they were calling around. They had a guy who at the last minute, 5 days before the semester, had to drop out because his wife got a job out of town. And so when they called around, they called to Warren Wilson. Warren Wilson said, we got this guy that applied here, but we don't really need him right now. You might be interested. So then I get contacted by App State University. I'm still living in Atlanta at the time. So I'm desperate to have any experience teaching. And so I was fresh out of grad school and started teaching. And but they only needed me for one semester. So for that semester, I would drive from Atlanta up to Boone and stay there for 2.5 days and then go back to Atlanta. And I did that for a semester. I was teaching 2 classes. And but I jumped in last minute and took this class over. And my grad program like really taught me how to do that. So they all were really shocked I was able to do that so well. But the grad program I went through at Georgia State like taught me how to be able to do something like that. So I came back from that, and then no teaching jobs on the horizon from that, and so went working. I was at Lowe's by that time. No, this was still at the co-op. And so 5 years went by, had not taught at all, gave up the idea of the possibility of teaching. And then Western Carolina University got a hold of me because they were looking for somebody, because they had a professor get sick third week in the semester. And they were looking for somebody who could just jump right into teaching Asian religion classes. And the App State chair of the department had been the chair of the department at Western Carolina before that. And so he told them about me, and they contacted me, and I went in, jumped in third week of the semester, hadn't taught in 5 years, jumped right in. I was teaching a class on Asian philosophies, one on Eastern religions, and then the third class was a Hinduism class. And so I did so well that they kept me around. The professor got well and came back, but her health was off and on, so I was teaching some of her classes, but eventually she had to retire early. And then I did well enough where they wanted to keep me around, and they even let me create some of my own courses. So now I teach at Western Carolina University. I do courses on Asian religions, but also I do a course on the mythology of gods and comic book superheroes. I do a course on cults. We call it Cults and Covens. It's on new religious movements. And then I've done a course a few times on Afro-Caribbean religions. They're talking about bringing that one back. And then next semester I'll be doing a course on mysticism. It's a course I wanted to do for a long time, and so now I have the opportunity to do that. And so, yeah, it's something I never thought I'd be doing this for a living. It's, definitely feels like it's what I'm supposed to do. I'm always thrilled to get up and lecture on this stuff, and just always thrilled to share ideas and types of thought and religious beliefs and forms of spirituality that a lot of kids aren't familiar with and you have never been exposed to, and, have, mixed ideas about some of their ideas, or like stereotypical ideas, and then they're always surprised when they learn more about those things and they find out there's a lot more to it than what they thought. Perfect example is the course on Buddhism. A lot of people just think Buddhism is just meditation and maybe reading a few books on Buddhism, and they don't realize the whole history of Buddhism and even all the different styles of Buddhism and the different doctrines that are related to each style. And they're always very surprised at how deep it goes, much more than what they thought. Same with Hinduism. They always think of they come in thinking of Hinduism as being, well, that's the religion that has like thousands of gods, and they're always surprised to see that really, in a sense, it is still monotheistic, because all of the different gods and goddesses are thought to be emanations of the one formless, shapeless God known as Brahman, and all the gods and goddesses are just emanations of that God. And so it's funny that somebody from my background would ever even make it to the point where I'd be up there teaching these kind of things. I mean, even when I'm doing it, it kind of blows my mind. That I always think about everything in my life that led up to that point, and just the unlikeliness of me doing it. And I mean, my parents, of course, knowing me all my life, they're not surprised at all. They said they were just sitting back waiting for me to finally, get things going in that direction. They said they always saw the potential for that, even though I didn't. And then also, I just turned 60 this year, and I've been married 3 times, and they say 3 times is a charm. And so my wife, of course, is much younger. She never had kids. I had kids from before. And so I have a 7-year-old son and 3.5-year-old daughter now. And she works as a physical therapist at the Veterans Administration Hospital here in Asheville. And we just made kind of a home for ourselves here. And it's and a lot of my stories, I'll be able to tell my kids, and they probably won't believe half of it. A lot of my motivation when I was younger was I was consciously trying to I called myself trying to accumulate stories to tell the grandchildren, but I ended up overdoing it, and I have so much that they wouldn't believe. My wife didn't believe all the stories, like of all the street adventures and all that, until when we started seeing each other, and she got to meet my sister and then my parents and the other relatives, and she got to hear the stories from them. They were telling stories I totally had forgotten about until they were telling. I was like, oh my God, I forgot about that. And so she saw that all the stuff that she thought maybe I was exaggerating was like real. And yeah, it's just there's so much more. Each of those little sub stories is like an adventure to itself, like the street adventures. Like, for one example, like I had a couple friends who were crack dealers, and one of them, out of curiosity, had to drop off stuff one time, and I ran into him as he was dropping things off somewhere, and I was like, do you mind if I go with you? And I was always the type that wanted to see things for myself, so I'd put myself in situations so I could just see things for myself instead of hearing about things. And we went to a house of someone who I won't mention their name, but their parents left them the house, and he got on drugs so bad he just let the house fall into disrepair, sold all the furniture out of the house. There was no furniture in there or anything. And so he opened the door. He looked like just a shell of his former self, and there were other people I knew in there that I grew up with, and they all just looked like zombies compared to their former selves. I mean, it was really a hard thing to see, but I wanted to see it myself. And so he gave them the drugs that they wanted to buy from him and all that, and then we went and left from that. Now my friend who was the dealer, he never touched the stuff. For him it was all about just making money. And I knew a few guys like that who, for them it was just making money. They never touched the stuff, and they thought people were like completely out of their minds for even doing anything like that. But they saw it as an opportunity, which a lot of people I knew did in that environment. Like, I used to work at factories and warehouses, and I had friends that were making lots of money selling drugs. I knew people who were actually buying homes with cash, like paying for a new house cash. That was when you could still put the bag of cash on the table and sign the papers, and the house is yours. You can go to a car dealer, put the bag of cash on the table, and the car is yours. And so I had friends who, saw me like struggling and working hard and all dirty and dusty and driving beat up cars. And I had an offer once, like a friend said, look, I'll set you up. I'm tired of seeing you in this kind of situation. I'll set you up. You won't even have to do anything. I'll give you the people to work for you. All you have to do is collect the money. You take your share, you bring me my share, and you won't even have to be out selling anything. I'll set up everybody to be out there selling for you, because I'm tired of seeing you struggling, dirty, dusty, beat up cars, working hard. And it wasn't tempting at all at first, but it did reach a point where it became tempting. And also I had another offer, another friend of mine that I knew. He was part of a robbery, a group doing robberies. They were robbing banks, credit unions, the whole thing with the masks and the whole 9 yards. And they were looking for an extra guy. And I was in a local bar in the neighborhood, and the guy came up, offered to buy me a drink, said, cool, got the drink, we're talking. And I knew him because he was a friend of my sister's husband's. And I won't give that was probably too much right there. But so he said that the guys have been talking, they want to add an extra person, and my name came up. And everybody unanimously thought that I would be a good guy for the job. They knew my military experience. They knew that I was even tempered, and had a cool head in tight situations, because by then I had been in many crazy situations, and I was always the one with the cool head who could handle the situation. And so when he made that offer, I just told him, I said, look, you know what, thanks for the drink, and I didn't hear anything you just said. And he was like, cool. He was like, my man. He knew that meant like you know, I know what you do, I appreciate the offer, and I'm not going to say anything to anybody about it. And so at the time before I became a prison guard, those offers started becoming kind of enticing to me, because I was just working hard for like $5 something an hour, you know, like working hard, dusty, dirty, beat up cars, struggling paycheck to paycheck. And so those kind of things became a little more enticing, you know. And luckily the prison guard job came up right then, and then I was making 3 times the amount of money I ever made in my life. It gave me the opportunity to, like, you know, actually physically remove myself from that environment and live in like nicer parts of town, and it took me into a whole different social strata and everything. And I never went back, but it's funny because when I was going to college, I had an opportunity to rent a house really cheap back in the neighborhood off of like Maine and Ohio. People that know Columbus would know the Maine and Ohio area. I think it's pretty gentrified around there now, but so yeah, I said I would never go back to the hood. I ended up back in the hood only because it was cheap. And you know, some of my friends were there that did like social work or social activism and everything in the neighborhood, and would try to get me involved. I respect all that. I just never felt led to really participate in any of that. Like, I just had to kind of do my thing. My thing was just being a good example, you know. Like, I got into an argument with a friend of mine about that one time. He was like, how come you're not out on the front line like everybody else, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I think I do a good job as just being a good example, you know, and I just don't feel led to be out there like, you know, holding signs or anything like that. I was like, more power to all you guys, and that's great that you do that, but that's just not my particular place to be. And a good example of being a good example is when I was a prison guard. Something I did that I found out about the effects of it years later. I was working in the hole, and they were bringing a guy, and they called me up. This crazy. First, they called me up and said, "Do you have a cell with a big black guy in it that we can put this guy in with?" I was like, "Why are you even talking about that? What's going on?" "Well, we just want to put this guy in the cell with a big black guy." I was like, "I'm not going to do that." So they brought the guy, had an empty cell for the guy to go in, and when they brought him in, I saw his name badge and I recognized his name. He was the local imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan who was on the news because he got locked up for domestic violence. So his name was all in the news. And so when I saw the name badge, he saw that I read his name, and he looked at me and he said, "Please don't tell anybody in there who I am," you know. So it's funny, from Grand Imperial Dragon Wizard or whatever they call it, to like asking me to not say anything. So I was like, "Yeah, don't worry, man. I got a cell for you by yourself." So I put him in the cell by himself and didn't tell anybody who he was or anything. And because of course in the hole it's predominantly black inmates in there. It's funny, that happens. That was something in prison that stood out. Black inmates could get sent to the hole for things that a lot of the white inmates would get away with. And then also within the hole, when black and white inmates were in there together, they would, you know, talk from cell to cell and talk about what they got locked up for, what their prior records were and everything like that. And they all noticed that blacks who went before a judge for a particular crime and had a particular past history, conviction history, a white person generally could get convicted of the same thing and have the same prior record, but get less time when they get sent to prison. And the black and white inmates knew that. They talked about it amongst each other. It was like, you know, it was acknowledged by the white inmates too. They all knew that that's how it was. So I put the guy in the cell to himself, and then after not long after I was a prison guard, maybe a year after I was a prison guard, I was living in a duplex, and the people next to me were political activists who put on like demonstrations, and they were part of a group called Art in Revolution, and they would make gigantic like paper mache puppets where you people would hold the sticks and move the hands around, big parade like demonstrations. And so they were going to take part in a rally on police brutality, against police brutality. And one of my roommates told one of them that I used to be a prison guard. So they asked me about speaking in this rally. And not something I would have ever thought of doing, but they asked me about it, and I said okay. And they said, but first the guy who's organizing it wants to meet you before you can do this. And he's an ex-inmate. So I waited on the porch the day that the guy was going to show up, and guy gets out of the car. It's an inmate that I knew from the prison. And but it was one who, when he was locked up, he was being beat up by guards. And I saved him from being beat up. I stepped in and threw the guards off of him and everything and saved him from being beat up. So when he saw me, he was like happy to see me. I was happy to see him. And so he was like, he told the people like, yes, this guy can definitely speak at this thing. So I spoke at the thing, and then we became friends. And he told me that Grand Wizard Ku Klux Klan guy, that after that incident, the guy changed his whole outlook and dropped all his racist views and everything. And he told my friend, whose name was Dan Cahill, he just passed away, I think it was last year, told him that the catalyst that made him drop his racist views was the way that I treated him when he got sent to the hole. And so that's a perfect example of like, my actions, and I didn't intend on that. My thing wasn't, I'm going to treat this guy good so that maybe he'll change his mind. I didn't care whether he changed his mind. I don't even care about that kind of stuff. And not knocking those that do, because it's something that should be cared about. It's just, I have things in my personality that are a little different, and I just don't, sometimes I don't care about things that I maybe should care about, or people think I should care about. But I'm just type A. I let people do whatever they're going to do. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. So my actions weren't to have in my mind, I wasn't trying to have a positive effect on this guy. I was just doing my job in a professional way. But even doing that, like, had a long-term positive effect on somebody's life. So my friend who argued with me about my lack of activism, I used that as an example. I told him about that incident as, because even when I was in the streets, like, I had a really positive reputation in the streets. There were a lot of times where things were blowing up and people were about to shoot each other, about to fight, and just me showing up made everybody stop. The only time I got there a little late one time, something escalated and people pulled guns out, and I was coming around the corner and I was still about a block away, and the shooting started before I got there. But it was a situation where if I would have got there before the triggers were pulled, I'm sure because of the two guys that were doing the shooting, they would have stopped as soon as they saw me. Like, I had that kind of effect. And people used to tell me, like, you should be like a public leader or something like that. Again, I had no interest in that. I'm just trying to live a good life based on, again, the things that I learned from books like the Upanishads and the Chinese writings called the Tao Te Ching, and things I learned from martial arts. And I think I've had way more of an effect on people just living a decent, respectful, thoughtful kind of life, as compared to if I would be out, like, preaching something or trying to go around and convince people to change and things like that. Now, there are people who work in that capacity that I think do well in that capacity and are like, that's where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing, but that's just not for everybody. And so, I mean, I feel fortunate and honored that I've had that effect without trying to have that effect. And I think that's what my place in life has been. And so again, like, I can reflect, and there'll be so many stories I can draw from the streets and from the prison experience, and even from growing up as like a neighborhood oddball, because I was a neighborhood oddball growing up. I mean, somebody had to remind me of that every day. It wasn't just my own assessment of myself. Somebody took it upon themselves to remind me of that at some point every single day as I was walking around the neighborhood. And but now my students see all that in me, the oddball side, but that's part of what endears me to the students, I think. And my classes have become pretty popular. Like last semester, I had a lot of students who, at the beginning of the semester, I always have the students tell who they are and what their major is and where they're from and why they took this particular course. And last semester, I had a lot of graduating seniors who said that they took the course because they wanted to take one more Rob Jones course before they graduated. So I always try to make the classes interesting, fun, and relevant. In a lot of my student evaluation comments, I always see where they say, you know, he takes this information and he makes it like applicable to everyday life. And I'm sure there's a lot of professors who would teach subjects like Asian religions and teach it from almost a detached view, like an anthropological type of view or something. But I try to take, you know, ancient philosophies and even aspects of like Eastern culture and show that how, you know, even in the West and even in the 21st century, we can take some of those same principles, some of those same ideas, some of those same outlooks, and actually use them in everyday 21st century life, even here in America. And how, you know, these ideas aren't something that's so exotic or far removed from 21st century life. And I always get a lot of Christian students too who are surprised when they find out like how similar a lot of the ideas are to ideas that are associated with Christianity, and also how much older a lot of these ideas are compared to the Judeo-Christian religions and religious ideas. Like, yeah, a lot of the stuff predates that. Like, for instance, they're always surprised when they hear that Confucius was the first one to say, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, you know, 500 years before Christ. And then when they find out that, you know, the conceptions of God being a spirit and everything that exists being like an emanation from God, when they find out that that was talked about by the Hindus, you know, a couple thousands of years before Christ, and thousands of years before even Judaism, you know. And but I always try to show where, you know, it ties in and it's saying the same thing but in a different way, you know, but also show where there are definitely stark differences as well. And so just having the opportunity to teach that way is, again, it's like, it's, when I'm doing it, I just can't believe that I'm able to do it. And I'm really fortunate and appreciative of the opportunity to be able to do it. Like tomorrow in the cults class, I'm doing a lecture on a little known movement that kind of flourished in Harlem a little over 100 years ago, where there was all these prosperity preachers that became very rich, you know, in Harlem during the Depression. And one that set up like a large community, and his income was estimated to be about $20,000 a week in the 1930s in Harlem. And he considered himself to be like God in the flesh. And so the students, like, just to be able to teach about all that stuff, and the students get such a kick out of it. And I enjoy bringing out like little known things in history and some in recent history. Like in the cults class, we do that a lot. Like yesterday, the lecture was on Scientology. And then tomorrow in the Buddhism class, we're talking about the core doctrines of Buddhism, the core tenets of Buddhism. And again, I always try to teach it in a way that doesn't seem so exotic and far removed. With teaching Eastern religions, a big part that people are surprised by is, like I mentioned Confucius before, the idea of Confucianism, which technically is not really a religion, it's more like an ethical system. But one of the key parts in Confucianism is about relationship with family. In Chinese, the word is xiao, which means like filial piety, which is the way you relate to your family, your elders, and not only your elders in your family, but your elders within society. There's a whole philosophy behind that in Confucianism. And and then in Hinduism, the idea is, for instance, like the students always ask me about what's why is it so important to have a son in that context? And it's because the oldest son's responsibility is that when the parents become elderly, he's the one that has to take care of his parents. So the oldest son in Hindu culture, when they get married, they don't move out, they move their wife into the house, and they raise their family in the house with the parents, and then they take care of the parents when they get older. So, and a lot of that societal structure and family structure still exists there. Here, of course, it used to be like that. One good example I'll give, like growing up in a Midwestern, blue-collar, working-class, industrial-type environment, I grew up in a black neighborhood. I'm born and raised in black neighborhoods. My parents were born and raised in black neighborhoods. My parents are both black, but they're both from families with multicultural backgrounds. And it's funny, that's another thing I can get into. Like, I already knew my multicultural background, but then with the Ancestry.com thing, it confirmed, I took that test and it confirmed a lot of stuff that I was always told, and then with some surprises, but that's another thing. But, you know, in that environment, all the households had two parents, you know, and the only households that didn't have two parents was if one of the parents had died. So, you know, I was in this, you know, it was a tough neighborhood, like blue collar, tough neighborhood, but everybody had two parents. And so I was lucky that, you know, growing up that way with both figures there. But then later on in some of the generations, like just up under me, you started seeing more people get divorced. So then I was around people who were not that much younger than me, but we saw this shift where a lot of people were getting divorced, but not only getting divorced, but a lot of women that were a little younger than my parents were starting to now have all these kids, and the father wasn't around, and there'd be little or no contact with the father. And well, in some cases, I mean, I have some relatives, younger relatives, who have kids, and they have no idea who the father even is. Which is typical. I mean, you would think that that's like an atypical thing to have a child and not even know who the father is. But in that kind of environment, in that kind of setting, you know, not only are the males promiscuous like that, but a lot of the females are so promiscuous that they can actually be pregnant and actually not have any idea who the father was. So a lot of the people my age, we saw that shift occur, and, you know, we took note of it. When I was in the street, I was, you know, hanging out with a lot of guys who we were kind of like ghetto philosophers and ghetto anthropologists who would notice what was going on, and we sit around while we were smoking weed and we talk about it. And that was one of the things we noticed, that shift right there. And then with that shift, we saw people who were products of that shift come into the workforce behind us, coming into those factory and industrial jobs behind us, and not having any kind of work ethic, not wanting a paycheck, but not wanting to work, getting fired. And these were all these guys who didn't have a father. We saw this complete shift. And when I started working as a prison guard, I was already almost 30 by then, and the prisons were starting to be flooded. They were building prisons left and right, and the just influx of like inmates, it was all these young guys who grew up without fathers, who were the ones that were like a little bit behind us generationally, not a full generation behind us, but like a half generation behind us. And we saw this tremendous shift. And, you know, and like I said, I grew up with two parents, but, you know, I spent time running the streets, and I was responsible, but wild at the same time. And in that wildness, I ended up having kids that I had very little contact with. My oldest she'll be 42 this year. She's actually my stepdaughter, but I was married to her mom. I started raising her when she was 2. She knew her biological father. He was from the same neighborhood as me. He was just a career criminal in and out of prison. And so I was there raising his daughter. And she, you know, saw me as her father, even though she knew that she had a biological father. And we're still very close to this day. So it's ironic that I was able to raise her and maintain a relationship with her, but later on, I had one kid who I didn't know about. I knew the possibility of her and didn't meet her until she was 18, and had contact for a few years and everything, but then it was kind of off and on, and I haven't actually had any contact with her for a while. Her phone numbers would change a lot, and we just kind of lost contact. And then I have a son who I just started having contact with again, but while he was growing up, you know, I lived in a different town, didn't have a car most of the time he was growing up. I paid child support for him, but I hardly got a chance to see him. And then at a certain point, like, you know, I just hardly was able to see him at all. And, you know, I was just caught up in my own life and not really being responsible and not really thinking. And before then, I used to look at people who did that as being like, you know, horrible people. And the next thing I know, like, there I am in the same boat, you know. And even though I was in that boat, I knew, well, I'm not a horrible person, but why am I not keeping contact? What is it, you know? And it's not that I didn't love my son or my daughter and didn't think about them and care about them, but you know, you actually, in my instance, I reached a point where, you know, I thought that they would be better off not knowing me, because during those years I wasn't accomplishing anything with myself. You know, I was just struggling. I had low self-esteem, and I really honestly felt that they were better off not even knowing me. And so it's, you know, so it's odd that my life turned around after all those years to a point where I had some kind of self-esteem about myself to where I could eventually be married again. I didn't have any kids with my second wife, but where I could eventually be married again and have kids and raise a family. And, you know, and there is a part of me inside that definitely feels like, you know, not necessarily guilty, but just where I wish I would have done different in the past, to where I would have like really put forth more of an effort to maintain those relationships, especially seeing how now I have those relationships now with the kids that I'm raising. And then with my oldest, who biologically is not even mine, I've maintained a very strong relationship with her whole life, you know. And, you know, I definitely feel bad about it. And luckily my son, he just got married and they just had a kid, and his wife like urged him to get a hold of me. And that's how we've like reconnected recently. But before then it was really off and on, like, you know, and he told me the last time I talked to him that, you know, he had a lot of negative views about me, some things that his mother told him. And I mean, that happens a lot too. You know, part of it, I got to say, yes, there are definitely men who don't care about their kids. I've known those guys personally who don't care, and they're not around because they just could care less. I've known those people. Those people have told me that that's how they are, and I know that exists. And then I know other men who they just get so caught up in themselves that they just don't make the time. And then there's also the factor of the mothers who tell the kids very negative things about the father. Some may be true, even though some of the things are true. I don't think it's the mother's place to do that, because there should always be an open door for the possibility of the father and child getting to know each other. And then if the child has those questions, then it can be on the father to answer those questions about themselves honestly, about like what they were like and what they were doing during those years that they had no contact. And during those years, I definitely thought about my kids a lot, you know, like daily. And again, part of it was my own self-esteem issues. Part of it was, I found out later through things that he said. Like, for instance, when he was a kid, he would say things that I know he wouldn't have come up with himself. He had to be getting it from somewhere. And I did find out that his mother was saying bad things about me. He had an aunt who was saying bad things about me. And, you know, and at one point she had even told my son I was dead, which is a terrible thing to do. Regardless of how the father is and the condition of the father. Yeah, there's always the possibility that the father will get themselves together. I mean, as they say, everybody can change. I mean, I've known some people who never changed and died never changing. But as long as you're alive, there's a possibility of change. And I know it's hard a lot of times because people break up, and then there's animosity, and then there's children involved, and then the animosity gets like put on the child, but the child had nothing to do with the animosity. But sometimes the child grows up thinking that all the animosity is because of them, and it's not. And so that causes a lot of problems. So you end up having, especially with young men, you have these young men who didn't have that kind of presence there, and they end up, becoming bitter, angry, and that through that bitterness and anger, they end up running with the wrong crowd. They end up doing things they shouldn't be doing, getting in trouble. Luckily, my son, he did have a really good mother who, kept him not exposed to certain things. And that also came into play when he was really small. I wanted to bring him up to Columbus for the weekend sometimes with me. Sometimes she wouldn't let me do it because she didn't want him around the street environment at all. They lived like out in the country, and which I understand not wanting him around that environment, but I was his father who happened to be in that environment, and I wanted to spend time with him and have him with me. And if I'm someone's father and they're spending time with me and that's where I live, then that's what they have to see, And so that was not a good excuse to keep me from him. And then I reached a point where I did kind of give up on the idea of having a relationship because of how hard it was of dealing with that negativity, and then also finding out things that were said about me and all that. And not to fault her, because I never fault her. She was only being reactive to the animosity of us not being together. And I totally understand that. And then, it just made the attempts harder and harder. There was even one time where I went to visit, a planned visit, and a lot of times I had to borrow a car because I didn't have a car a lot of those years. And so I get down there for a planned visit, nobody's around. And then later on she said, "Oh, I forgot you were coming." But it was a planned visit. So there's a lot of factors like that are involved. And, and it's hard to tell a young man to just pull themselves up by the bootstraps if they don't have any examples of someone doing that. I was lucky enough to have an example of a very strong father, very strong grandfather, but also had a strong mother and strong aunts and uncles and strong grandmothers. And I was just raised in an environment where everybody was strong and determined and everything, despite not, having, not being well off. And so, and my son, for example, without a father, he stuck to his guns and did well in school, did well in sports. In high school, he was the center on the basketball team and the quarterback on the varsity football team at the same time. And he's done well for himself. He's working as a prison guard now, which I told him don't stick with that because he went to college, but you can make good money, and he lives near a prison, so the prison's near where he lives and everything. But it's interesting him going into that from he has no street background at all. So it's interesting him going in. I asked him how he's doing, how he relates, and he said he's doing fine. He's 6'4", 240 athlete, so physically he has no problem like that. And but yeah, it's definitely a problem in our society today is that too many people are growing up without fathers. But I knew some people who didn't have fathers who at least had father figures, had strong uncles or family friends that would kind of serve as a mentor, but not formally like a mentor, but kind of be there and as an example. But then I've known guys who had no examples like that. And yeah, it's very unfortunate because I luckily, like I said, I had a strong father, uncles. One kind of thing that was common with all the men in my family and and all the men that were friends of my father's, they were all very, very strong men who did not put up with any kind of mess, but at the same time, they were all complete gentlemen. They kind of reminded me, if you watch the movies about the mob, you know, and how the mobsters are like these gentlemen, but they don't take any mess. That's the kind of thing I felt like when I would watch like old gangster movies. I felt like my father and all of his friends and my uncles had that kind of personality without being gangsters. And so I grew up with that example. And yeah, I mean, there definitely needs to be more programs. I think there are programs that exist, but definitely more programs where young men can come together and be, you know, meet men who maybe have gone through the exact same thing as them, but can show them how you cannot let that define you. Because environment is a big factor, but I've known people, like a lot of families that I knew growing up, you'd have families where everybody was like, you know, good, respectful, responsible, and you'd have the one kid, for instance, that would, you know, end up just spending their whole life in prison. Then I knew families where everybody was criminals and just the mother and fathers were just crazy out of their minds and everybody was in trouble all the time. And you have the one kid in that household who would end up, you know, becoming like a doctor. I've seen that. So environment plays a big factor, but it doesn't have to be like the thing that completely determines the outcome. And just like me, I mean, not that I was headed down that road, but I was working on a loading dock thinking that was as far as my life was going to go. And, you know, but there was that little inkling in me that was able to like somehow get myself out of that. And I think that if you can at least have that little inkling of that instilled in you, that when the opportunities present themselves, you'll take the opportunity. It's when you don't have that little seed planted is when the opportunities might be right there and you won't see it. And so programs like that would help young men like get together and get those examples, that they'll be getting seeds. So even if they attend a program like that and meet people in a program like that and then leave from a program like that and not necessarily make a change right away, at least those seeds will be there. And if those seeds are there, if an opportunity presents itself, there's something inside of them that can react to that opportunity that opens up to them. Whereas one of their peers, the same opportunity could open up to them and they wouldn't recognize it because they don't have that seed planted. So that is very important. And again, you know, being an example, you know, I've definitely been an example to a lot of younger guys, that not only prisoners, but then even on the street. When I was hanging on the street, there was something different about me where they could see, okay, you know, he's out here hanging out with all of us, but he's not like all of us. Maybe we don't have to be like this either. And so in my own way, I affected lives that way. And hopefully maybe from this video, like somebody can see this and see that, you know, that, you know, you don't have to be stuck in the circumstances that have been placed around you by virtue of being born to who you were born to and growing up in the neighborhood that you grew up in and going to the schools that you went to. Because I went to public schools that were, you know, not the best schools. And, you know, I was somebody who was intelligent but didn't want to apply themselves. They call that an underachiever. In high school, I had teachers who I'd walk into class and they say, "Are you going to do anything today? Are you going to participate? Or are you just going to sit there?" Oh, yeah, I'll just go back here and sit here and read my magazine. You know, teachers who didn't even like care what I was doing with myself. And that's unfortunate too, because not that teachers need to try to save the world or anything, but part of the job is at least caring enough about your students to where if you see someone going off the rails or not applying themselves and you see that they have some kind of potential, at least try to talk to them and get them to like understand and see the potential that they have. And I know it's hard, especially in public school, because the way a lot of students act is very disruptive. There wasn't a lot of disruptive schools like that when I was growing up, but my junior high school was particularly disruptive though. But yeah, that could be a problem to reach people in that environment, but it is possible. I know it's hard being a teacher in that environment. I couldn't even imagine. When I was like going to school, people were asking me, you know, would you ever want to teach public school? I knew I wanted to teach college. And jokingly, I would say, yeah, I couldn't do public school because I don't want to end up in the news. Because I personally am the type, like, you know, I don't care how old or young you are. If you're going to try to swing at me, then, you know, you got to, you know, I just wouldn't put myself in that situation. But I respect those who do and are able to, you know, keep cool and maintain, and definitely hate to see when teachers get knocked out or hit in the face or whatever like that. And you know, just I think there should be like, there should even be some kind of counselors in school that are there, that, you know, big strong guys who are counselors. I mean, some of you big strong guys out there that might be in college right now, think about that as an occupation, not just the whole, what they call it, there's a position that they call that now where the person is there to like intervene in conflicts or whatever. No, there should be like a sit-down counselor who has that kind of like presence and demeanor, who's like able to sit down and talk, and someone who's not just someone who studied the statistics of that background in college and then they're going to try to talk to you. That's totally ineffective, because that's someone that's relaying information that they only learn through books and through study and maybe doing an internship in the hood. That's respectable, but they need somebody who's actually lived what they're living, and, you know, as far as having a better chance of like reaching where they're at. And you know, fortunately for me, like, I'm teaching college, so I really don't encounter that much in college. Every now and then I've had a student who is from those kind of backgrounds, and they've made it into college, but they're not really applying themselves in college, where they've come to me because I'm an open book with my students. They know where I'm from and most of what I've done and everything. And so I've had students like email me for like meetings, and I've actually, you know, got to affect people in that way. One guy, he was a black guy from the hood in college, but he was completely washing out, like not doing his work, just not paying attention in class, you know, just had this total nonchalant attitude about it. I don't even know why he was even there, wasn't applying himself. And he asked me, I want to pass this class, what do I need to do to pass this class? I said, well, let's meet and I'll tell you. And I wrote down a list for him of what to do, everything he needed to do to pass the course, because he was failing. And he not only took it upon himself to start doing everything on the list, I didn't even put this on the list, he changed his appearance. He like started wearing the pants not sagging, wearing a nice shirts, and just changed his whole appearance, his whole demeanor, paying attention in class, and went from like failing to, if he would have put that much effort at the very beginning, he would have gotten an A. He was failing, and he at least got himself to where he got a C+ by the end. And then from there, he applied himself in other classes from there, and then was a much better student. So it's always possible at any age. And again, anyone out there watching this video who sees himself as being potentially someone who could affect people that way, go ahead and consciously do that. Or if you're someone who sees yourself as someone who doesn't have a chance of like bettering themselves, like, it's possible, regardless of what your friends, don't worry about what your friends think. Don't worry, you might even get discouraged by your family members. You might even get discouraged by your parents to better yourself. I've seen that. But you can take it upon yourself to do what you need to do to better your own situation, and forget what anybody else says. But go ahead and do what you need to do for yourself. And you might have resentment that you didn't have a father around, but guess what? Now you'll have an opportunity to be a father who's around for somebody else. So definitely, like, let's break that cycle. You know, I'm actively part of that cycle myself, and breaking it now with my younger kids, and hopefully being able to reestablish relationships with my older kids. And And you got to remember too, like by being that way, you're playing into the stereotypes that there are people who don't know any minorities personally, and they think that we're all exactly the same, and they think that that's all we are. And I'm an example that that's not all we are. One good example of that, for instance, in white society, right? Okay, white people have no problem accepting that there are all different kinds of white people, not just economically, but even interest-wise and lifestyle-wise. No problem accepting that there's all different types of white people. But there's some of them that want to think that all black people are exactly the same. You know, that we're this monolithic, singular thing, you know. No, we're as diverse and different as, I mean, I don't even like to talk in groups because each supposed group is so diverse that you really almost can't call it a group. You know, and same with black people. You can't really call us a group. We're so there's so many types and so different. We look very different. We are very different. We have very different interests. And I think what happens in the media is we get presented this idea of black culture that really came from this more recent kind of hip hop culture, and people think of blacks as being just all hip hoppers who can't speak proper English and wear their pants sagging, and they think that we're all like that, no matter how old or young we are, no matter how poor or how wealthy we are, that we're all like that. And I think the example is seen, and you see it in entertainment, and you see it in sports, because a lot of people that are athletes are people that are from that environment, but now they're rich, but they're still from that environment, and they still present themselves that way. And so kids see that kind of way of that these celebrities are presenting themselves, and they just think that's how they should present themselves too, you know. And so in the media, society at large gets that picture, and that's how they think that all black people are. And the thing is, like, you know, why follow along with that picture? I mean, some of you, that's not even really who you really are inside, and you're just following along with the picture because that's how your friends are, that's how your environment is, and you're just kind of following along. And like, let's not only break the cycle of children growing up with no fathers, but also break the cycle of perpetuating the negative stereotypes in black culture. Because it's gotten to a point where society at large sees black culture as one big negative stereotype. And you know, if you're in black culture, you know that's not what it is. And those that are like that only represent a portion, a subculture within black culture. I mean, black culture has a very rich history. For instance, like the neighborhood my father grew up in Columbus, it was like a whole self-sustained black community when he was growing up. The grocery store, the bank, the furniture store, the appliance stores, the law offices, the doctors, everything was black, and they all lived in the community. So all the money stayed right in the community. And there were other communities like that in different cities. Like Harlem was like that at one time. Of course, there was the one that's famously known in Tulsa as the Black Wall Street, where the massacre took place. Because, you know, they didn't want to see blacks, you know, actually thriving like that. And those kind of settings can happen again. It's not an isolationist idea. It's just, you know, an idea of like actually creating communities where we are like keeping money in the community and supporting each other. And in that type of support, you'll have people grow up in that environment that maybe they won't remain in that environment their whole lives, but they'll grow up in that kind of environment and go out and live in the world at large amongst diverse sections of the population with that kind of like determination and that kind of integrity. And it'll show that black culture is more than what's being represented mostly in the media. And so, yeah, very important, very important. And it's funny, I talk about that, and I grew up in a black neighborhood and everything, and then they talk about black culture and black community and all that. You know, I am black, but like, I don't feel a part of any particular community. Like, you know, like how they would refer to like people like Al Sharpton as black leaders, and I would think, black leader? I don't have any leaders. You know, I'm my own leader, and that's part of it right there. Be your own leader. You know, don't rally behind stuff. You know, you be your own leader, and you represent yourself with integrity and being, you know, distinguished in your own way, and not have to. I mean, it's okay to rally together on things, but I think there are people who do that and sometimes miss the point of like advancing themselves and get behind advancing a cause and maybe not advance themselves. And that's some of the problems that we see like with certain movements, and later on the movements kind of get discredited because certain key figures in the movement, it's found out that they've misappropriated funds and things like that. And or people get behind certain movements and you know, and wear the t-shirts and hold the signs, but aren't really doing anything to better themselves and carry themselves with more integrity. That's why we end up with the looting and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's especially now, it's something that needs to be addressed and dealt with at large because of the climate that we're in right now. We're in a climate that's looking for all those stereotypes, that's looking to point out all those stereotypes, and looking to point those stereotypes out so that they can limit people. And it's almost like they want people to be in those stereotypes as an excuse to limit people. And so it's one way to break out of it by, you know, demonstrating and protesting and getting up in arms about it. But then there's certain aspects of that that are also playing into the stereotype that they're trying to perpetuate. And just so by bettering oneself in the midst of all that and standing tall and like with integrity is the big thing. Like integrity means like, you know, carrying yourself a certain way, not only publicly, but maintaining a certain character about yourself that when no one else is around, that's still who you are. It's not putting on a face, like you being that person that you are at all times, and that person that you are being someone who has integrity and dignity and character, and not a kind of dignity that tries to present oneself as being better than anyone else, just the kind of dignity that presents oneself as being an equal human being, you know, because it's not about, that's another thing that happens with a lot of movements. It's a positive thing to want equality, but a lot of times in the movements, the strive toward equality is done through this whole way of presenting oneself as being superior. It turns into that, which that's the same thing that the people that you're against did. So that has to be dropped. Just equality means just, you know, really seeing yourself as being equal and presenting yourself in a way that others will have to accept you as equal. And I know there's a problem with that because my dad told me something when I was a kid that has truth to it. And some people think that, you know, why would a dad tell somebody like that? But my dad had a saying. He said, you know, you could cure cancer and they'll still see you as a N-word. And it's true, unfortunately. But if we start to change things about ourselves and the way we're carrying ourselves and integrity and rising above the stereotypes and actually actively getting rid of the stereotypes and raising kids who aren't falling into those stereotypes, you know, maybe one day somebody of color could cure cancer and society at large won't still look at them as being a, you know, I think we're a ways off from that. And it seems like we've taken a lot of steps backwards as a society. And I say we because to me, in this particular society, being here in America, we're all Americans and we're all in this together. I'm not seeing the separation. You know, all parts of society are a reflection of society as a whole, and we're all part of that. So even those who would be racially prejudiced against me, I'm in this with them. We're in the same country. You know, we have to eventually rise above that together. It's not like one group is going to rise above that and the other ones won't, and everything will be okay. No, we got to work on that together. Not that there'll never be racism. Racism is actually a natural thing. It's not something I think will ever be eliminated, but can be minimized. And a lot of that minimalization of that is just through education and through exposure. A big thing that's on everybody's minds now is the girl that was stabbed on the train. And that's been used and politicized, unfortunately. I mean, regardless, I know they said that he said, I got that white girl and all that. But one example I saw recently was where something like that happened in reverse several years ago. And, you know, where a white guy had stabbed a black girl. And it was about 7 years ago, I think. I forget what state it happened in. And they immediately said, well, the white guy's mentally ill. But when the black guy does that, it's not looked at as he's mentally ill, you know. But he might be. It should all be treated the same thing, but the same way. But what happens is, you see how they put all the pictures up of both the victim and the perpetrator, and that was done on purpose, like to present an image to the public, where you had the young blonde white girl with the black guy with the dreads who had the like criminal looking appearance. And a lot of people who don't know any black people, and they see that in the media, like I could be walking down the street and they see me and they're going to see me that way, you know, and want to cross the street because they see me coming because of that kind of thing in the media. And, you know, I understand it. It's a natural reflex response on their part because they have their agenda and they're a subgroup. They don't represent. There's some people who would look at that and think that represents all white people. Definitely does not represent all white people, no more than the stabber guy on the train represents all black people. And that's one thing we got to realize. But without exposure and without changing the stereotypes and changing the public perception, the media perception, as long as that's not changed, though, the chance of me being able to walk down a dark street at night and not be feared by somebody is very unlikely. And I would like to see that change, because I've had that happen. I've been the guy waiting on the elevator and the elevator door opens and it's a white woman on the elevator by herself, and I could see the fear on her face. And there's been times where I just don't get on the elevator, you know, but I shouldn't even have to go through that. I should be able to go through life without experiencing somebody in fear of me because I want to get on the elevator to go up to whatever floor I need to get into, or somebody not crossing to the other side of the street, you know, which I've had that happen before because they see me coming, you know. And it's a shame. And the biggest part of that that is on my mind quite a bit is that, you know, the idea of having to go through life being aware that there are people who, if they thought that they could kill you and get away with it, they would do it. And the only reason why they would want to kill you is because of the color of your skin. What kind of way is that to live? I mean, that's ridiculous. Like, I'm actually the guy that if I saw them in trouble being assaulted or something, I'm the guy that would like save them, you know, like, and so it's crazy to have to even go, and I'm aware of it all the time. Like when I'm driving around, I'm aware that there are people who, you know, who would see me in the car at a red light, and even though they're not doing anything because we didn't have any confrontation, but would look over at me, and in their minds, they're thinking of me as someone that they would want to kill. And they don't know me. I've never done anything to them, never said anything to them. I mean, there's times where I've gotten the look in public too from people, you know, and it's like, why? I'm the guy that would save their lives. You know, it's so, yeah, it's a lot to work on. A lot I just said. Some of it might sound idealistic, but you know, it's possible. It's sad. Like, it actually saddens me that I have to live in a society like that, and it saddens me that the media perpetuates it. You know, and it's so crazy because, like, humans are humans, no matter what race you are, economic status, there's great people and there's completely messed up people within white society. I hate to say that, but within white society, within black society, within the LGBTQ society, there's like great people and terrible people in every. So the division is not between whether you're black, white, gay, straight, young, old, rich, poor. The division is in, you know, who's a good person and who's not. The division is in who, you know, who is, how could I put it, like,
who does good and bad.
Yes, good and bad. That's the division. Who does good and who does bad. Whose presence is beneficial to others and whose presence is negative or potentially dangerous to others. That's the division. And those who are on the good side should like foster that more in people and present that more in people. And because there's a lot of people who you don't realize are just on the fence between the good and the bad, and their encounters are what affect the way that they're going to go. You know, just like the Grand Wizard Ku Klux Klan example that I gave, you know, just the way that I treated him changed his whole life. And my intention was not to even change that guy's life. So very important to think about. So a lot is on our plates here. And that went on to like a lot of philosophical stuff. And again, this is from my own view and my own experiences and my own things that I've encountered, and also things that have been encountered through a neurodivergent mind. That would be an important thing, because you know, a lot of people would maybe not agree with me on all points and maybe not understand how I could almost be in some ways detached from some of the things I was talking about, but also be concerned at the same time. And that definitely comes from my neurodivergence. And again, you know, just anyone watching this, hopefully this will be of some value or help to you in your own lives, and that you can take something from this and apply it to yourself. And anything that I've mentioned, like, again, like books like the Upanishads or Confucianism or anything, you can like look into this stuff yourself. Google, we got to Google now, you can Google it. Mention the Theosophical Society and Helena Blavatsky, you can Google that. Yeah, Hindu stuff, you can Google any of that. And yeah, so hopefully it'll be of some help to somebody.